This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, we're very, very pleased to welcome Gerri this evening, a world-renowned expert on Mansfield. I've got just a few of her books in front of me, but she's had a hand in many more than this. She's currently editing the complete collected works of Katherine Mansfield, which is a very important academic accomplishment, and I think volume 3 is coming out in the autumn.
Just on the first lot of proofs, that'll be out in October. That's all her non-fiction. So poetry, reviews, critical writing, essays, pastiche, parody.
Thank you very much, Gerri.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to be talking, I know you did have in the autumn term, Andrew Thacker also did a talk on rhythm, so but I'm hoping that this won't replicate anything that he did, because I'm going to be coming from a completely different angle. So, from May 1911 to March 1913, Katherine Mansfield contributed to and eventually helped to edit with John Middleton Murry a short-lived little magazine called Rhythm, with a bias towards the arts, post-impressionism and the philosophy of Bergson. It is now widely regarded as one of the earliest and one of the most significant modernist magazines. Indeed, it advertised itself elsewhere as Rhythm, the unique magazine of modern art. Its experimental modernism was closely connected to the visual arts, especially Fauvism. This paper seeks to highlight Mansfield's editorial and financial influence through her close association with Murray, together with her literary contributions to the magazine, focusing less on the short stories which have been examined elsewhere, but more specifically on a relatively unknown poem, To God the Father, for which I will offer a reading with biographical implications and suggest a hitherto unnoticed visual source. In addition, the paper will evaluate the impact of the unusual number of foreign and émigré correspondents and contributors by way of a chronological overview of the magazine's contents over its entire run of 14 issues, with a special focus on the Polish connection, and we'll come on to that later. Mansfield herself was a colonial immigrant, a New Zealander living in London. Indeed, Peter Brooker confirms that, quote, the modernists were frequently émigrés and immigrants, displaced persons in an antagonistic relation to the features of metropolitan modernity in their host cultures. This was certainly the case with many of Rhythm's contributors, and is one reason for the magazine's emphasis on radical experimentation in art. Subset beginnings. The two French post-impressionist exhibitions of 1910 and 12 in London had an unprecedented impact on both English artists and writers alike, including Mansfield, by introducing new modes of French aesthetic perception, and engendered the following hysterical response in the popular press, and I quote, "This is a widespread plot to destroy the whole fabric of European painting." That was an editorial in the Morning Post. 11 years after viewing the first of these exhibitions, on the 5th of December 1921, in a letter to Dorothy Brett, Mansfield recalled the effect upon her of Van Gogh's Sunflowers. This is a really famous quote of Mansfield's. That picture, this is the one on the left, Sunflowers, seemed to reveal something that I hadn't realised before I saw it. It lived with me afterwards, it still does. That and another of a sea captain in a flat cap. They taught me something about writing which was queer, a kind of freedom, rather a shaking free. It was therefore within this era of prolific cultural interchange that Murray, together with his Oxford friend Michael Sadler, who eventually would become Mansfield's publisher at Constable's, and J.D. Ferguson, the Scottish artist, whom Murray had met in Paris earlier in 1911 as co-editors, produced the first issue of Rhythm in the summer of 1911. From the very outset, Rhythm's editorial slant was towards, quote, the ideal of a new art. As the editors famously stated in their first issue, before art can be human, it must learn to be brutal. Our intention is to provide art, be it drawing, literature or criticism, which shall be vigorous, determined, which shall have its roots below the surface and be the rhythmical echo of the life with which it is in touch. In the first issue, Murray himself attempts to clarify the editor's ideals with one of the very first printed references to the word modernism. The artist attains to the pure form, refining and intensifying his vision till all that is unessential dissolves away. He must return to the moment of pure perception to see the essential forms, the essential harmonies of line and colour, the essential music of the world. Modernism penetrates beneath the outward surface of the world and disengages the rhythms that lie at the heart of things, rhythms strange to the eye, unaccustomed to the ear, primitive harmonies of the world that is and lives. Discernible in this early statement of belief from June 1911 is an uncanny resemblance to Mansfield's own later artistic philosophy. Her memory of seeing a Van Gogh painting, quoted above, inspiring that notion of shaking free, reveals those moments of pure perception expounded here by Murray. As Mansfield wrote in a letter on the 2nd of May 1920, delicate perception is not enough. One must find the exact way in which to convey the delicate perception. One must inhabit the other mind and know more of the other mind, and your secret knowledge is the light in which all is steeped. On the 3rd of February 1921, she moved further towards defining her artistic aesthetic. Here is painting and here is life. We can't separate them. I believe the only way to live as artists under these new conditions in art and life is to put everything to the test for ourselves, to be thorough, to be honest. Your generation and mine has been put off with imitations of the real thing, and we're bound to react violently if we're sincere. I too have a passion for technique. I have a passion for making the thing into a whole, if you know what I mean. Out of technique is born real style, I believe. There are no shortcuts. The émigré status of many contributors to the new magazine, coupled with the plethora of international correspondence publicising the new avant-garde movement, meant that rhythm possessed a transnational identity from the outset. Many of the contributions from artists and writers alive and dead, such as Picasso, Goncharova, Vyspiansky, Carco, Derain, Sobienowski, Van Gogh, would go on to become establishment names. Smith notes how many rhythmists were in voluntary exile from their own national, social and familial constraints. As far as the established art world was concerned, as exiles they were also outlaws. Occupying a position at odds with or opposed to a received mainstream, out of a conviction that they stood for something better or more modern. This placed them in an alternative or counter-public sphere of cultural formation. That was a quote from Picasso. Moreover, roughly half of the regular contributors to rhythm were women, which was unusual for the time. They included Mansfield herself, Ferguson's then partner, the American artist Alice Dell Rice, Jessica Dismore, and Dorothy George Banks. As Brooker notes, discussing this woven cultured alliance in Paris between 1907 and 1914, one senses the rare existence of a mixed and congenial, relatively democratically organised, male and female artistic community. Murray claimed that by the autumn of 1911, rhythm had become at last a succès d'estime. Gradually, most of the prominent writers of the younger generation had gathered round it. Gilbert Cannon, Hugh Walpole, Frank Swinnerton, Walter de la Mare, Rupert Brooke, and finally D.H. Lawrence. In the first issue, summer 1911, it was initially published as a quarterly. No editors' names are specified or foreign correspondents mentioned. Francis Carco contributes 2 short pieces of creative prose in French. There is an artistic study by a 30-year-old Pablo Picasso, already becoming a highly regarded artist, who in 1907 had exhibited with others in Paris at the recently opened gallery run by Daniel Heinrich Kahnweiler. A German art historian and collector, Kahnweiler became one of the leading Parisian art dealers of the 20th century, promoting as well as Picasso, Georges Braque, André Derain and others who had arrived from far-flung parts to live and work in Montparnasse. He marketed their work not just in Paris, but also through Europe and the Americas. As Picasso famously remarked, what would have become of us if Kahnweiler hadn't had a business sense? This first issue also contains a picture by Anastel Rice. Another initial contributor, who became a regular until the magazine's demise, was Dorothy Georges Banks, who Anthony Alpers describes thus. I've tried to find an image of her, but I couldn't. I Googled and Googled for all I was worth, but I couldn't find one. So you've just got the quote. A big, heavy woman with a flabby face like Oscar Wilde's. She wore men's clothes and was always weeping. In her chaotic flat in Paris, Murray got square meals and he picked up her enthusiasm for a wild young Spanish painter named Picasso. From the outset, rhythm had a particularly strong French literary bias. Throughout its short life, both Tristan, Derème and Francis Carco were regular correspondents and contributors, writing articles in French. In issues 2 and 3, Autumn and Winter 1911, there are a range of articles on a number of European artists, artistic movements, writers and composers, including Fauvism, the philosophy of Bergson, Claude Debussy and Vincent van Gogh. Issue 3 also contains a full-page advertisement for the first time for Hampstangel's, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, so apologies, gallery in London, which is a branch of the Munich-based Franz Hampstangel's fine arts publishing house, showcasing photographic reproductions by the so-called Post-Impressionists. So you can see there, it actually says so-called. Now we call them the Post-Impressionists. This is a new term. In issue 4, spring 1912, Mansfield makes her first appearance in the magazine with a story set in the wilds of colonial New Zealand, The Woman at the Store, loosely based on another short story, The Drover's Wife, by the Australian writer Henry Lawson. Both stories emphasise the loneliness and harshness of life in the bush, especially for women, and this brutal aspect, which entirely accorded with the journal's manifesto from issue 1, as outlined above, particularly attracted Murray as editor. Mansfield also places 2 poems in this issue, Very Early Spring and The Awakening River, and if you look at the bottom you can see they are apparently translated from the Russian of Boris Petrovsky by Katherine Mansfield. The reason for the Russian, they were both written by Mansfield. The reason for the Russian-sounding pseudonym is unclear, but it certainly extends the continental character of the magazine. As Vincent O'Sullivan notes, Mansfield, with a passion for all things Russian at this time, cultivated a Slavic air in her verse, while her prose provided the brutality and colour that Murray's editorial policy demanded. There is, as usual, an equally strong Gallic feel to this issue, with reproductions and paintings by the French Fauvist painter Henri Mangin, André Dunoyer-Sibonzac, a poem in French by Jean Pellerin, and 2 short stories also in French by Claudien. And emphasising its growing international outlook, the magazine lists for the first time its agents abroad, several in Paris and 1 each in New York, Berlin and Munich. Sadly, after issue 4, financial troubles beset the magazine. The ensuing hiatus lasted several months until Mansfield suggested that Stephen Swift, the publisher of her collection of stories in a German pension from 1911, take over the production. When Swift himself went bankrupt shortly afterwards, Martin Secker and Edward Marsh stepped in to help. Mansfield, ever practical, offered her annual allowance from her father, which at the time was £100, to help keep the magazine afloat, and with a sound business head, worked hard, quoting Ian Brooker, worked hard at canvassing advertising, which Murray had earlier blithely declared as unessentials. Eventually, the debts left by Swift led to Murray being declared bankrupt in February 1914. So from issue 5, in June 1912, Mansfield is now officially listed as editorial assistant to Murray. So you can see editor John Middleton Murry, assisted by Katherine Mansfield and Michael T.H. Sadler. So she's now financially involved with the magazine and of course therefore more able to bring her own contacts and specific literary interests to the attention of Rhythm's readers, especially with regard to Eastern Europe and Russia. In fact, she, Murray, and their ever-widening social circle held strong convictions about the singular importance of Russian literature, and these were reflected in many of their creative endeavours. So with this issue, the beginning of the second volume, the magazine moves to a monthly format and the editorial team now mentioned by name, as you can see there. And a foreign correspondent listed for the first time, the American Julian Park, an earlier contributor to issue 2. A note at the end of this issue advertises a special exhibition. It's the section on the invitation of the town of Cologne. A special exhibition of the work of rhythm artists. You see, on the invitation of the town of Cologne, a special exhibition of the work of rhythm artists is forming part of the international exhibition now being held there. It is significant that English art is to be represented there solely by the work of contributors to the magazine, which is quite interesting and emphasises the importance of this really small little avant-garde magazine in promoting artists. In this issue, Mansfield actually publishes a poem using her own name, The Sea Child. Its prominent position on the first page underlines her newfound status on the magazine staff. Furthermore, she also reviews a book by John Galsworthy and, with Murray, writes her first co-written, lengthy editorial style piece on the meaning of rhythm. And it's the last paragraph at the top of that page. Art and the artist are perfectly at one. Art is free, the artist is free. Art is real, the artist is real. Art is individual, the artist is individual. Their unity is ultimate and unassailable. It is the essential movement of life. It is the splendid adventure, the eternal quest for rhythm. The confidence of their beliefs, which such a joint statement proclaims, and Mansfield's strong voice throughout this issue, reveal much about their relationship, both personal and professional, and also reflects their joint editorial style and shared ambitions. In this issue, in issue 6, July 1912, a Polish correspondent is first mentioned, the writer Floryan Sobienowski. I was very lucky because it's very hard to find a photo of Sobienowski, but I have a dear friend in Poland, Mirosława Kubasiewicz, who located this for me. I think it's a photograph that's been sort of coloured. People did that, didn't they? And it's sort of made to almost look like an illustration, although I think it is actually based on a photograph. Mansfield had met Sobienowski in the summer of 1909 in Bavaria when she was 21, following a confinement and subsequent stillbirth. For a few months until December 1909 and her return to England, the two were lovers. And I've written extensively on this relationship, which I think has a lot of biographical implications, in an article which is going to be published in a co-edited volume that will be brought out by Palgrave in early next year, co-edited with Jacques October. Whether it was Sobienowski who introduced Mansfield to the work of Chekhov and other Russian writers is a matter of conjecture, but it is clear that he fostered in her a lifelong love of Slavic and in particular Russian literature. During the time of their relationship in 1909, Mansfield wrote what was to become one of her most famous poems to Stanislaw Wyspiański. And although the poem was translated into Polish by Sobienowski and published in a Warsaw paper on the 26th of December 1910, and here you can see it, it was published in English only in 1938. And so I wonder, would Mansfield have tried to flaunt her contacts to Murray and his Oxford colleagues by telling them that she personally knew a Polish writer with sound knowledge of European literature who could act as Rhythm's Polish agent and help the little magazine to spread its influence into Eastern Europe? I don't know. Or had Sobienowski perhaps started making a nuisance of himself, asking for help? Also entirely possible. Whatever the truth, by issue 6, July 1912, Sobienowski was listed as the magazine's Polish correspondent. However, what Mansfield had rather naively not bargained for was Sobienowski immediately travelling to England to seek her out. She must have told him that she was now in a relationship with someone else and that he must not discuss their own past relationship. He obviously agreed. Note the word friend in Murray's account below, but in return she knew there would be a payback of sorts. Murray recorded his own reaction to the new Polish correspondent. Suddenly, a Slavonic friend of Mansfield's came to England, and being penniless, came to us, with 2 big black trunks full of books and manuscripts, for he was a writer. Once again, we resented this intrusion upon us, not personally, but as an unkind stroke of fortune that would not suffer us to be alone. We made him welcome, though he was a burden to our purse as well as our spirit. In the solemn autumn evenings, the house would echo to his forlorn Slav songs, and once more we would be spellbound by a sense of the precariousness of all things human and lovely. In dire financial straits themselves, he wrote more. Ever since the breakup of our home in Rompton, we had been supporting him. He was indeed nominally our lodger at 15 shillings a week, but since his method of paying this sum was to borrow from us at the rate of 25 shillings a week, we were not notably profited. By the time that we ceased to keep a reckoning, he owed us more than £40. And when we finally plucked up the courage to declare that we would support him no longer, we had not merely to move again in order to get rid of him, but to lend him a further £15 to make him go. Alexander Yanta, however, reveals a fascinating point. Despite the distress Floryan caused her, Katherine Mansfield was willing to work with him. She helped him try to introduce the poet and playwright Stanislaw Wyspiański to the English stage. There was a plan to devote an entire issue of Rhythm to Wyspiański, and I only discovered that quite recently. There's some papers in the University of Tulsa library which explains all this. It never came to fruition, but that would have really, really done a lot to introduce Wyspiański to the Western world. The magazine collapsed before it could be effected. Of course Mansfield agreed to help Sobienowski. By this time she had absolutely no choice. As Mayers confirms, Floryan's power over them was based on his past sexual relations with Mansfield. Since Floryan threatened Mansfield, and Murray, who never suspected she had been Floryan's mistress, was passive by nature, they were forced to tolerate him until they could pay what he demanded. Murray, though, even if passive by nature, must surely have found the relationship perplexing. Interestingly, the above document by Yanta in the McFarlane Library in Tulsa records the fact that an entire issue of Rhythm was planned, as we note, devoted to the work of Wyspiański. That would have been a considerable achievement, and personally I lament its loss, and done much to raise early awareness of Wyspiański's genius outside his native land. It's also worth noting that Sobienowski remained the Polish correspondent until the very last issue of Rhythm in March 1913. Also in issue 6, there is reference to the Rhythm artists, again as a collective group, underlining the distinctive creative style and approach taken by the magazine, and it states, "The next number will be illustrated by the majority of the rhythm artists." Again, that sense of a collective, which I find so fascinating. Mansfield continues her authorial and editorial prominence with two book reviews and another joint editorial piece with Murray, this time called Seriousness in Art. And they write, and I think it comes there, sorry, I'm pointing here and you can't see, it's about 7 lines down. "True seriousness is an assertion, a courageous acceptance of the unexplored. The false is a negation, a cowardly clinging to the outward or known. The mob treads over this patch of threadbare ground with mechanical regularity, so poverty-stricken in itself that it asks for nothing but the tokens of poverty, and is only comfortable and at ease when it finds nothing further. The land whereon these people live is barren and desolate, lying parcelled and monotonous in the midst of an unknown sea. The artists sail in stately golden ships over this familiar and adventurous ocean. Their gay flags of greeting stream in the sunlight, and far-off winds blow in their great sails and in their hair as they go sailing by." I think it's a beautiful piece of writing. And once more, the editors comment on the lure of the new modernism, with its greater seriousness in dedication and the paucity of preceding artistic expression, in a manner redolent to some great Homeric adventure. And note too, those of you who know Virginia Woolf's essay, Modern Fiction, and even T.S. Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent, you see how in 1912, Mansfield and Murry had got there first, about the idea of the old writers and the old artists versus the new, and looking for a different way. Those old writers stuck on that island as the new writers go sailing forth in their stately ship. You know, they got there first. And predating similar famous essays by Woolf and Eliot on that same subject of Pound's dictum of making it new. In issue 7, August 1912, which contains another study by Picasso, numerous foreign correspondents are now listed, including for the first time a Russian correspondent, Michael Lykiadopoulos, described by Bruce Lockhart in Memoirs of a British Agent thus: "Michael Lykiadopoulos was the talented secretary of the Moscow Arts Theatre. Lyki was a strange, lovable creature, and I've never understood this, how you could be 1/3 Greek, 1/3 Russian, and 1/3 English. Not sure about that. His real work in life was as a translator. He had real literary flair, an excellent Russian prose style, and a quite remarkable knowledge of 8 or 9 European languages. He knew most of the great writers of Europe and had translated their best works into Russian. These credentials made him an excellent choice as Rhythm's Russian correspondent, as he is so named from issue 7 until the journal's demise. And there is a curious connection between Bruce Lockhart, friend of the renowned occultist Aleister Crowley, who had been introduced to Lockhart by Lykiadopoulos, as well as to others such as H.G. Wells, Robert Ross, Lytton Strachey, Granville Barker and Gordon Craig, and Mansfield herself. Her lifelong friend, Ida Baker, noted that Mansfield, prior to first meeting Murray in December 1911, and I quote, was caught up briefly in an odd group of people with an interest in the occult. The leader of this group was Aleister Crowley. Katherine was invited to an evening during which hashish was taken. One can speculate that during this period she might have met Bruce Lockhart, who in turn may have introduced her as someone with a passion for Russia to Michael Lykiadopoulos. Sadly, Mansfield eradicated virtually all her personal writing from this time. So, I mean, it's really frustrating, but we don't have the evidence, but I do think it's entirely possible. There are now outlets for the magazine in Warsaw and Krakow. Thanks to Sobienowski, certainly for Krakow, together with a new outlet in Helsingfors, the Swedish name for Helsinki. So you can see now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 outlets in Paris, got New York, Munich, Berlin, Helsinki, Warsaw, Krakow. Again, for such a small magazine, it really is impressive. Mansfield's contributions consist of another book review and a trio of interlinked fiction sketches, Early Spring, The Following After and By Moonlight, under the title of Tales of a Courtyard, which in their Eastern European settings and Russian names once more demonstrate her Eastern European outlook. And they're very unusual stories, and there's been very little work done on them. As if to reinforce her growing confidence in her roles both as writer, and assistant editor, there are 4 contributions by Mansfield in the next issue, number 8, for September 1912. So we have a poem by Boris Petrovsky on the first page, a short story, How Pearl Button Was Kidnapped, by Mansfield using another pseudonym, Lily Heron. Heron was a Beecham family name and the middle name of her brother Leslie. She publishes another story, Spring in a Dream, under her own name, and finally a book review. Given Mansfield's prominence as a contributor to rhythm at this time, perhaps it is understandable that she resorts to several pseudonyms. Yet her influence as assistant editor is just as dominant. Spring in a Dream is preceded by a poem by William Orton, another former lover, from 1910-11. And the story itself is accompanied by a full-page pencil drawing of Sobienowski by Kazimir Wielkomirski. Both stories reveal Mansfield in full rhythmist mode. How Pearl Button Was Kidnapped, originally drafted in 1910, is an astonishingly modern story of Maori entrapment and Pakeha assumption, quotes by Angela Smith, while Spring in a Dream, almost completely ignored by critics, once more sees Mansfield in Eastern Europe with her characters Dmitri, Gertrude and Conrad, and an autumnal Chekhovian rural landscape setting. Issue 9 in October 1912 may be viewed as proof of Mansfield's creative and editorial domination of the magazine, underpinned by her financial backing, as noted earlier. In this issue, she publishes no less than 3 short stories and a book review, and in addition, Dorothy George Banks produces this full-page caricature of her. There are also several pieces by other regular contributors, including a self-portrait by Picasso and a story by a new contributor, Leonid Andreev, translated from the Russian. We don't have the name of the translator, but it's entirely possible, of course, that it would have been Michael Lykiadopoulos. In issue 10, November 1912, Mansfield places prominently on the first page another of her poems, again allegedly translated from Boris Petrovsky, called God the Father. And I'll just read it out. To the little pitiful God I make my prayer, the God with the long grey beard and flowing robe fastened with a hempen girdle, who sits nodding and muttering on the all-too-big throne of heaven. What a long, long time, dear God, since you set the stars in their places, girded the earth with the sea, and invented the day and night. And longer the time since you looked through the blue window of heaven to see your children at play in a garden. Now we are all stronger than you, and wiser and more arrogant. In swift procession we pass you by. Who is that marionette nodding and muttering on the all-too-big throne of heaven? Come down from your place, greybeard. We have had enough of your play acting. It is centuries since I believed in you. But today my need of you has come back. I want no rose-coloured future, no books of learning, no protestations and denials. I am sick of this ugly scramble. I am tired of being pulled about. Oh God, I want to sit on your knees on the all-too-big throne of heaven and fall asleep with my hands tangled in your grey beard. Following a visit to Krakow, I discovered by chance that Mansfield's poem was directly inspired by a monumental stained glass window of the same name, titled God the Father, Let It Be, designed by Stanislaw Wyspiański for the Church of St. Francis in Krakow portraying a monumental figure of God in the act of creation. And I'd literally gone into this church and there was this beautiful stained glass window. You can't imagine how tall it is. I don't know, it's at least 40 feet. I'm hopeless, but I think it's massive. And it's called God the Father. And there you have the God with his white long beard, etc., in the act of creation. Mansfield's description of the God in her poem directly refers to the image of the God figure as represented by Sobienowski. The window had been installed in the Franciscan church in 1904, 3 years before Sobienowski's death in 1907. Mansfield could surely only have heard of it through Sobienowski, who may have shown her a photographic reproduction. However, it is also entirely feasible that she visited Krakow with Sobienowski in the autumn of 1909. Certain is my hypothesis. Certainly there are the stars, and it is the same church. It's just an incredibly beautiful church. I can't recommend a visit to Krakow for all sorts of reasons, but this church is astonishingly beautiful. We know that for certain on the 10th of November 1909, she wrote to her younger sister, Jean, thanking her for her birthday money and announcing that she had bought a fat Polish dictionary. I'll read the whole quote because it's such a fascinating quote. Your birthday gift, little sister, is here beside me on the table, a fat Polish dictionary with a green leather binding and an air already of great weariness with life. In fact, it goes about me every day. Last night, sitting working here, the great jug of scarlet blackberry vine threw a twisted shadow on the wall. Rather, my lamplight, more than a little fascinated, stenciled for me the trailing garlands with a withered finger. And so I thought of you. Did you get the thought? Did you find it hanging onto the edge of your skirt? Good gracious, is that a cotton? Where can I have picked it up? My dear, allow me to present you with a Bavarian mind wave. It's quite an astonishing. I mean, Jean would have been, I don't know, 13 or 14 at the time, and here you have Mansfield in full sort of symbolist, decadent mode, talking about wizards and Bavarian mind waves and scarlet blackberry vines. It's a fascinating piece of writing. But there you have that reference to that fat Polish dictionary. What on earth for? According to Alpers, Ida Baker recalled in old age that Mansfield had made plans with the Pole to go with him to his homeland, and then to go perhaps to Russia. But Ida only knew what Mansfield had told her, and the visit to Poland may well have been concealed from her and subsequently obliterated from Mansfield's personal papers, as was almost everything from 1908 to 1911. On the 12th of December 1909, Mansfield's friend Vera French had written to her, begging her to reconsider going to live with Sobienowski. And all this story of their relationship is in this chapter in the book Katherine Mansfield and Continental Europe, which Palgrave Publishing in the new year. And it is a fascinating story. But in any case, whether she saw the real thing or only a reproduction, the image of what has now become Poland's most iconic stained glass window was etched into her mind when she wrote the poem to God the Father. Also included in this issue is a creative composition by a Japanese writer who would henceforth contribute regularly, Yone Noguchi. Noguchi was a prominent writer of fiction, poetry and literary criticism, both in English and Japanese. He made various trips to Europe and became a leading interpreter of Japanese culture to Westerners and of Western culture to the Japanese. And I've also written quite extensively on Mansfield's love of Japan and the Japanese. I mean, she was renowned. Many people said that she had the look of a Japanese doll. So this is, again, really interesting. As well as in rhythm, Noguchi was published in several English papers and journals around this time, including The Egoist, The New Age, and the Westminster Gazette. In issue 11, December 1912, there's another prose piece by Noguchi. Two woodcuts are published by a new contributor, Natalia Goncharova, a Russian avant-garde painter, costume designer, writer, illustrator, and set designer, whose great aunt was Natalia Pushkina, wife of Alexander Pushkin. There is also a drawing, beautiful drawing, by Michael Larionov, one of the most famous Russian artists of the 20th century, and a founder of the Russian avant-garde, who lived in France after 1915. Mansfield publishes 2 more poems under her own name, The Opal Dream Cave and The Sea, both written in Rottingdean in 1910, at the same time as The Sea Child, published earlier in Rhythm in June 1912. However, the most important contribution, I think, to this issue is the article by Sobienowski on the life and achievements of Poland's most celebrated artist, Stanisław Wyspiański, called the Polish Leonardo, and I don't think that's an understatement really, because of his artistic talents in so many creative fields, together with a black and white version of the colour painting that you can see there, Wyspiański's self-portrait, pastel self-portrait. Here in this article is a clue to the inspiration of Boris Petrovsky's poem To God the Father from the previous issue. And I quote, there's a little quote from the article which you have in front of you. From the National Museum, the way leads to the Franciscan Church, where there are 3 more of Wyspiański's stained glass windows, St. Francis, St. Salome, and God the Father. So you see, even in the issues of rhythm, the clue was there. Mansfield's poem, To God the Father, and Sobienowski mentions the stained glass window, God the Father, but it took me on a trip to Krakow, quite coincidentally, to see the painting, the stained glass window, to make that connection. The article is a eulogy by Sobienowski to Wyspiański. Recalling Wyspiański's funeral, he writes in the article, and this is how famous Wyspiański was in Poland. From farthest Poland, crowds of sorrowing men came to Krakow, thousands and thousands. A holy, profound silence possessed all the city. The common things of day were hidden away. On the 19th of January 1913, the same article would appear in the New York Times, as Sobienowski pushed for worldwide recognition of his country's most celebrated artist. And I do think it's worth noting, I'm always astonished by the number of people who genuinely have never heard of Stanisław Wyspiański, who is Poland's greatest artist. And he wasn't just an artist, he was a stained glass window designer, he was an architect, he was a playwright, he was a furniture designer. Have I missed anything out?
He was acting as well, I think.
He was a
theatre, acting as well.
Yes.
But I don't think we consider him the most famous. The most famous for his period.
Yes, at the time,
Yeah.
yes, clearly. Yes, obviously. At the time, there was no one bigger. And the Wyspiański Museum in Krakow is incredible. You know, it's in a beautiful building and it's massive, with work upon work, gorgeous, gorgeous paintings that just take your breath away. And he deserves to be better known outside of Poland. He truly does. I have a real passion for this artist. In the final 2 issues of the magazine, Mansfield and Murry are officially listed, and here we have for the first time, as you can see, edited by John Middleton Murry and Katherine Mansfield. So she loses that assistant editor nomenclature, and here we have her finally in the same, at the same level as Murray. So the first of these last 2 issues, issue 12 in January 1913, features mainly regular contributors, but we do have a painting by Cézanne and another drawing by Larionov. Here's the Cézanne, the bathers. Again, you can see how avant-garde, so in touch with the new, the experimental, everything that was going on was there in this little magazine. Boris Petrovsky contributes another poem, Jangling Memory, though curiously there is no mention this time of it having been translated by Katherine Mansfield. It just says Boris Petrovsky. Mansfield herself contributes her 7th and final story to Rhythm, Old Underwood. Millie would go on to appear in the Blue Review in June 1913, and completes a trio of stories set in the harsh outback of New Zealand, if we include The Woman at the Store, disregarded for many years, but recently the subject of extensive critical analysis. And my friend, Professor Janet Wilson, has done a lot of work on these colonial New Zealand stories, which are really exceptional. Forgotten for many years, but now considered as some of her finest stories. Alpers claims that these stories offer, and I quote, insights into the social isolation that used to be common in New Zealand, and they were written in a cultural isolation that was total for the author. No one who read them in London could have known what in fact they achieved. For Smith, Angela Smith, in these stories, Mansfield explores the savagery of a group of Pakeha, and white New Zealanders, who have limited choices. They are impressive for their fauvist vigour and have a Bergsonian dimension in their portrayal of the self. These three New Zealand stories pivot on an obvious barbarism. Each describes one murder and gestures towards a second. In all of them, the interest is not primarily in the plot, but in the repression and inarticulacy of the inhabitants of a surreal and brutal landscape. In issue 13, February 1913, there are several new contributors, including the modernist Australian artist Horace Brodsky, who supplies a woodcut. And you can see the woodcut there, and this wonderful bust of Horace Brodsky by one-time friend of Mansfield and Murray's, Henri Gaudier-Greshka, who would sadly be killed in the First World War. Vladimir Palunin also contributes another wonderful etching. Palunin came to England as Diaghilev's main designer for the Ballet Russe and stayed on to teach scene painting at the Slade School of Art. This is incidentally the first issue since number 3 in which Mansfield makes no direct contribution. In the last issue of Rhythm, March 1913, Mansfield's final creative contributions to the magazine take the form of poems. One assigned to herself, Sea Song, and one written by Boris Petrovsky. There was a child once. According to Ida Baker, the latter poem concerned Mansfield's relationship with William Orton. For Mansfield, these publications must have felt like the completion of a cycle, as issue 4, in which she made her first appearance with Woman at the Store, also contained 2 poems. And then finally, we have Rhythm at that point stopped publication and eventually came out in a much reduced form, as far as I'm concerned, with a new title called The Blue Review. The Blue Review, the successor to Rhythm, ran for only 3 months, from May to July, edited by Murray, with Mansfield as an associate editor, but this time with far less influence. Her role seems to have been limited to correspondence, according to Jenny MacDonald, who's done a lot of research in this area. The list of contributors included D.H. Lawrence, Gilbert Cannon, Rupert Brooke and other poets, with a few contributions from Murray and Mansfield, together with a few drawings and cartoons, but it truly lacks the international scope and visual excitement of its predecessor, and I think most people agree with that. There is a complete absence of foreign correspondence. They've all disappeared, so noticeable in Rhythm, and of many foreign contributions in general. That avant-garde feel has gone, and gone to that sense of being at the very threshold of something new, of something avant-garde, of something original. And so to conclude, Mansfield's contributions to Rhythm over the course of the magazine's short life consisted of 11 poems, 7 stories, 6 book reviews, and 2 editorials co-written with Murray. This was in addition to her duties from issue 6 onwards, isn't it, as assistant editor and then joint editor, when her influence on the magazine's contents and contributions was marked. Many items which did not bear her authorial name would nevertheless have been edited or revised by her. But I find it intriguing that it's her poetic contributions which dominate. We don't normally think of Mansfield as a poet, a fact which critical analysis seems to have overlooked. And in volume 3 of the Katherine Mansfield collected works, the Edinburgh edition, there are over 200 pages of poems which I collected together. It's a phenomenal number, and co-edited with Angela Smith. Vincent O'Sullivan remarks, "We may regard her poetry now as Mansfield herself tended to think of it, unassuming, often slight, serviceable enough for occasional published excursions into inherited effects and derived styles, yet capable too of unexpectedly inventive turns and intensity." When Murray first knew Mansfield, however, and you can see it's obvious from this, he would have considered her a poet just as much as a short story writer. Indeed, in November 1923, within a year of her death, in January 1923, she was just 34, Murray published his first of his edited collections was an edition of her poems, thereby demonstrating the importance he accorded this element of her creative endeavours. As O'Sullivan Riley comments on Murray's prolific posthumous publications of Mansfield's work, Poems by Katherine Mansfield was perhaps the single volume that would have caused her particular disquiet. Although she returned to writing verse at different times during her life, Mansfield made no claims to being a poet. Murray was determined to establish her as one. But actually, I think in the light of the new edition, I think perhaps we need to revise that. And don't forget, even as late as 1909, when Murray was editor of the Athenaeum, Mansfield was publishing poems under the another pseudonym, Elizabeth Stanley. She was also publishing stories in the Athenaeum, and lots and lots and lots of book reviews, which is another massive section of volume 3 of the Edinburgh edition. But she still thought of herself as a poet. In Murray's introduction to an expanded second edition of the poems, which he published in 1930, this is what Murray wrote. "I remember her telling me when we first met that the beautiful pieces now gathered together as poems 1911-13 had been refused because they were unrhymed by the only editor who used to accept her work. He wanted her to write nothing but satirical prose. This treatment made her very reserved about her verses. Those she published in rhythm appeared as translations from an imaginary Russian called Boris Petrovsky." Well, we know they didn't all appear as imaginary. They weren't all published by Boris Petrovsky. She did publish a few under her own name. The editor, of course, mentioned here, that's the quote from Murray. The editor, of course, refers to A.R. Orage and his weekly journal, The New Age, in which Mansfield published so many stories prior to Rhythm and a few after. Murray's relationship with Orage was never cordial, so here's that introduction to the poems from 1930. There was a little dig there at Orage. Indeed, he had blamed Orage for being instrumental in Mansfield's early death, since it was Orage who had encouraged her to go to Gurdjieff's Institute in Fontainebleau, though Murray himself had counselled his mortally ill wife against such a move. The butt of this 1930s jibe would have been obvious to all literary London. But more importantly, Mansfield, together with the other foreign contributors who gathered around this little magazine, engendered an exotic, foreign air, expanding out of England and looking towards a creative horizon that encompassed not just Europe, East and West, but the whole world, with its artists sailing in stately golden ships, their gay flags of greeting streaming in the sunlight, and far-off winds blow in their great sails and in their hair as they go sailing by, is that quote from that joint editorial by Mansfield and Murray. And I really do not believe that Murray wrote that. To me, and as people are nodding, that's pure Mansfield. Mansfield herself, an assistant and then co-editor, and through her own connections, fostered the journal's remit to escape beyond the confines of London for both its contributions and its sales. And as we noted earlier, at the height of its popularity in issue 7, August 1912, there were 7 distributors in France, 2 in Poland and Germany, and single distributors in America, Finland and Russia. So as a young, thoroughly modern, colonial New Zealander living in London with a passion for the new and the modern in music, literature and art, Mansfield could not have wished for a more creative man.
Thank you so much, Gerri, for such a comprehensive and fascinating talk. If people would like to ask questions now, and just discuss, Gerri.
I asked them to print off the Sobienowski article on Sobienowski, because just in the hope that, obviously some of you already know Sobienowski really well, but in the hope that it will engender some interest. And it is a fascinating article as well. And you can see there the black and white image, which is, there were no colour images in Rhythm, and I showed you the original self-portrait, the colour pastel. I don't think anyone in here is interested in me reading it all. I'd love you to take it away if you want to and read it for yourselves.
Gerri, I just want to ask, why do you think the Polish connection with Mansfield, in terms of her writing, why she identified with Poland specifically?
Well, because of Sobienowski. They did have, Mansfield actually became pregnant by Sobienowski, I'm convinced of it, when she returned to London in January 1910. Ida gave her some money, and she went back, and it's so sad, but she actually went back to her first husband, who she had left on her wedding day. What's the name? Sorry, I'm just so tired. George Bowden, sorry. George Bowden. And she went back to him, and she had apparently written that she was going back to him for the sake of, to try and make a go of things. But as Alpers said, the little monkey, Alpers didn't make that connection about her being pregnant again. But she had gone back because, again, to produce, to have legitimacy for yet another baby, which she got rid of. And that was why, and there are letters in the Alexander Turnbull Library in Wellington, imploring letters from Sobienowski. He was in Paris in January, she was supposed to be meeting him, and they were going to live together, they were going to get, be lovers, etc., have this wonderful life in Paris together, and she got cold feet and abandoned him, knowing, it's my conviction, that she was pregnant again.
I just find it interesting that he was such a thorn in their side, and blackmailed her later, but yet she still identified with the literature and culture and still wants to write poems in that style.
I think the Polish, her love of Russian and Eastern European literature and art stayed with her all her life. But I think there is an early Polish connection. I can't prove that she went to Krakow. I'd love to be able to prove that she went to Krakow. I just have these tantalising things, buying the Polish dictionary, obviously clearly to be able to converse with Sobienowski. It made me no more than that. But she spoke German and so did he. He also spoke quite good English, and so, and his letters to her, these ones, handwritten letters, which are really heartrending. Oh, Kathleen Moyer, Kathleen, my dear, when will you come back to me? I miss you so much, and things like that. This was not a fleeting affair. This was a real, deep-seated love. And she just abandoned him and left him in Paris and just thought, no, I don't want any more of this. And eventually, I don't know, he clearly went back to Poland.
Why do you think Murray didn't suspect?
No, because she didn't tell him.
But perhaps he didn't feel threatened by him either.
He didn't feel threatened, and he had no inkling, he had no clue. But there's another curious thing. You all know when she gave her advance on Bliss, £40, to retrieve the letters from this period, the pre-rhythm period, and Murray went to meet Sobienowski to get them back. And it's very curious because Mansfield actually says, I don't mind what you do with them, but I hope that you'll destroy them. But do you know, I cannot believe that Murray wouldn't have read them. If you were Murray, wouldn't you have read them? Yes. It seems, just as a normal human being, that you would have been really curious. And I think at that point, and I think this is the nadir of their relationship. At this, then or just very soon after, Murray becomes entangled with Princess Bebesco, which is the real low point of their relationship. Absolutely destroys Mansfield. This brief, when she writes that excoriating poem, I can't remember the title of it, sorry, about a husband leaving his wife, etc., etc. And then she writes that letter to Princess Bebesco, doesn't she, saying, Murray already has a husband, basically, leave him alone, you need to learn some manners, etc., etc. And I wonder if this, reading those Sobienowski letters maybe precipitated Murray into having this affair. Obviously I can't prove any of this. It's all conjecture, but it could be possible. It could be possible. But one thing that I did unearth, and that we use the wonderful Miroslava Kubasiewicz, is that in the Alexander Turnbull Library there are some pages of the Wisbianski's The Judges, a very famous Polish play called The Judges, but in Mansfield's handwriting, because in 1917 Sobienowski and Mansfield got together again, not saying sexually, and they collaborated on a translation of The Judges. I have no idea why. No one knows why. Mansfield's handwriting is so appalling in the Alexander Turnbull Library that even Margaret Scott, who transcribed every single word that Mansfield ever wrote, couldn't transcribe it. So they were left out of the notebooks. If you look at the notebooks, it says, at this point, there is a sort of a translation of The Judges which I was unable to decipher. But in the Berg Library in New York are the first few pages of it. And it's really, really clear. So Miroslava has found what we think was the original German translation that they would both have worked from 1910, I think it was. And she found that translation from which we have been able, Miroslava, she did all the work, was able to reproduce Mansfield and Sobienowski's translation of The Judges. And that's in volume 3.
So do you think that would have been in the special edition of Rhythm?
No, this is from 1917.
Oh, okay. And what's the material that's in the, is it Tolstoy or Texas for the special issue?
Yes. There's, in the special issue there was going to be a whole section on, a whole thing on Wisbianski, which never came to fruition.
Okay, that's
it. There was no material.
Oh, I see.
I think it was going to happen, but then the magazine folded.
Yeah. So this is just a letter?
There are various letters and things relating to Sobienowski. He went on, he actually translated a lot of George Bernard Shaw. He didn't die until 1950s, I think. And he was a well-renowned translator of English into Polish. Quite well known. But so they did get together again in 1917. At the time, Mansfield was living separately from Murray. She was in Chelsea in Church Street. They were living separate lives. It is curious.
I wondered how much you thought that eternal quest for rhythm continued to inform their aesthetics, both Murray and Mansfield.
Mansfield in particular, I think it did. I think Mansfield was completely taken up by it. She was all about the modern and the new. Murray, not so much. Sydney Janet Kaplan's written brilliantly about Murray's novels. and how absolutely dire they are. They are as unmodernist as novels can be, really. You know, they're a real...
It's called Still Life.
Yeah, I noted that, but I didn't read.
Sorry?
Floryan works and Still Life.
Oh, right, and well, it is actually called Still Life. But you can pick it up on eBay, actually. I'm not saying the first edition, but because it's now out of copyright, I think there's lots and lots of sort of like, you know, those print-on-demand type editions. You know, it's a slog to get through. It's not easy. He was no novelist, but I think he came to understand that. Murray's talents lay as an editor and critic, but not. He did try and he wrote poetry. He wrote plays, a play called Cinnamon and Angelica. He did for quite a long time. He gave it his best shot. That wasn't where his talents lay. For Mansfield, I think it opened her eyes, as did that first Post-Impressionist exhibition in 1910 that she talks about. It just, all this influence, I think she just absorbed it. Her pores were so open at that time, and she absorbed it all, remembered it, thought about it, and then reworked it, and out this stuff came. She was writing about the brutality of the New Zealand outback in 1911, you know, when nobody else was.
And am I right in thinking that none of those sort of impressionistic New Zealand stories were published as part of her own collections?
No, they weren't. I mean, people just forgot about them. You know, they didn't appear in Inner German Pension, which even, I mean, now there's loads of work being done on those Inner German Pension stories, which for years were just completely ignored. Oh, they were just almost, you know, not juvenilia, because she was an adult when she wrote them, but they were not her finest hour. But now, you know, scholars like Andrew Harrison and Professor Tom Martin in the States are going back to them, and really, there's some wonderful stuff. And again, if you want to know what Mansfield was like, because a lot of it feels semi-autobiographical.
I don't love Inner German Pension, but I love these stories that were only published in the magazines. They're so exciting.
They are, they really are. And people really now are coming back to them. And I think that volumes 1 and 2 of the collected edition helps, that we have put all these stories finally all together in one place, so that you can see them in that chronological ordering as they appeared in Mansfield's work. And they're extraordinarily modern.
Do we know anything more about why she didn't choose to publish them in a book collection? Or
I genuinely don't know, and that's the honest truth. I don't think. Mansfield had sort of, it's like with...
well, perhaps they were too experimental. I don't
perhaps
know.
they
That's
were.
conjecture.
Perhaps they were. But I mean, she never had them collected in anything else. And neither did Murray, did he, for ages? And then eventually, I think old Millie and I think they did eventually appear in the later, the sort of, I think the Constable did a big collected edition, and then there was the Penguin. I think a couple of them are in one or other of those, I'm not sure. But
In something childish.
in something childish. But certainly not while she was alive. No. Whether she didn't consider them good enough, that she wants to do something new or better. But I think they're brilliant. Yeah. It was just, I was just, when I was rereading some of the rhythm, because it's the wonder of it is rhythm and the Blue Review and so many other Modernist magazines are freely available, I'm sure you'll know, on the Brown, the Modernist Magazine website. It's just such a fantastic resource. You know, I use it continuously, and obviously I was refreshing myself in preparation for today and looking through rhythm again. And okay, I showed you some of those visuals, but it's just, you know, illustration after illustration, all these famous, people that would go on to become really, really famous 20th century artists, just in this little magazine.
Well, what I find really interesting there is this contrast between the arts and the written contributions, because when in that quote you used from Murray, when he's talking about the younger generation of writers, and he lists Gilbert Cannon,
Yes.
Watson and Eyre, D.H. Lawrence, and a couple of others, which are then the writers which are on the Blue Review cover. So actually, I just found it really interesting that we kind of ascribed kind of avant-garde status to the writing with it. But actually, it really wasn't. It's really the Georgian school that goes on to write in the Blue Review.
Well, beyond Mansfield.
But beyond
Mansfield,
yeah.
And
but then you've got stories by Yone Noguchi.
Yeah.
You've got other contributions as well.
But yeah, no, it's just interesting that Murray would see those contributors as being the younger avant-garde generation.
But then that underpins your point about was he a modernist in that sense, or was he harking back to the traditions? Yeah.
And actually his idea of modernism at that time was modern art and Ferguson.
Yeah. But he does use that word modernism. It is one of the first, I don't know where the first time modernism is, I don't know, but it must be one of the first in rhythm, that word modernism.
Was there an art centre for the Blue Review, and was Ferguson involved?
Ferguson wasn't involved.
No. It wasn't at all.
That ended with rhythm, didn't it?
Yeah. For a few issues before the end of it. It's like drink water. And so quite not very avant-garde at all.
But do you see Mansfield continuing to be influenced by Ferguson? Because I know they were friends. And
they were great friends. They were great friends.
We've
Angela Smith, I know, has done some work on this, but trying to. We still believe that somewhere there is. Angela says there was that she did sit for Ferguson. This is the tantalising thing, Where is that painting? There is evidence that she sat for him, but we don't know where it is. Angela knows a great deal about Ferguson, and of course Anastel Rice. They were together. They were a couple. Subsequently, they split up. But then Anastel Rice, till Mansfield's death, was one of her closest friends, and painted the iconic portrait that we all know.
Yeah, because I wonder how much that would have affected her relationship with Margaret Morris, Ferguson's subsequent partner, and whether there was a distance because there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of.
No, I think Murray maintained contact with Ferguson, and there are. I think Mansfield does mention Ferguson in some of her diaries and things, doesn't she?
Yeah.
But for a time, I think they were extraordinarily close. And where is that missing painting? If only we could find it.
Do you know what the evidence is? Is it the letters?
I think it's letters. I think it's the evidence is in. There's a couple of letters where she talks about it. No one knows what ever became of it. Yeah.
I have a really left field question, just generally about Mansfield and religion, just from the poem you're talking about. And would you consider her religious?
No.
Would you consider her atheist, agnostic? How would you place her? And obviously there was a period just before she died
when she became quite spiritual.
Yes.
But no, I think Mansfield, I wouldn't say that Mansfield was unconventional in the sense that she just had her own sort of notion of spirituality, I think. Towards the end of her life, she became what we would almost call now sort of quite New Age, which is weird from, pun on words there, but that's what we almost would have called her in that sort of idea. She became obsessed with cosmic anatomy. If any of you have tried to read, there is a copy at BL, and I actually own a copy, which I'm very fortunate to have, but it's unreadable. Vincent O'Sullivan will tell you that he tried to read it because he wrote a long piece for us in the Celebrating Katherine Mansfield book.
Is that Gergi's book?
No, it was written by M.B. Oxon, Louis B. Wallace, who was an early writer for the New Age. In fact, he helped to pay for the New Age, didn't he?
Sure.
Yeah, and he was along with Orage. What were they? What's the term for what they believed in?
Theosophy.
They were, he was a theosophist. And in 1921, he wrote this book, Cosmic Anatomy, and Orage sent it to Murray to review. But he must have known, this is all biographers say this, he must have known that Murray would have loathed it. Murray would have tossed it aside. And Orage knew that Mansfield would pick it up. That was his design. And she picked it up and she became obsessed with it. To the extent that actually none of us can understand why, because it's unreadable. It makes no sense. It talks about strange Eastern, mystic, Indian sort of things, but in a way that I have really tried, because I want to understand what she saw in it. I want to understand the principles of it, the philosophies behind it. But it's so hard. Her Eastern mysticism I can understand and get on board with, but cosmic anatomy I don't get. And she quoted passages from it, and it propelled her. And then she and Araj started to write to each other in code, and she called him, and in her notebooks wrote to China, and China is Araj. And she didn't even want Murray to know that. And of course, Araj and she went to Gujarat together.
So how do you interpret that poem, To God the Father?
To God the Father, I think she's literally, this is the stained glass window, whether it was a reproduction, whether she went there herself, you can see how magnificent the church is, how awe-inspiring it is. Whether you're a complete atheist, you walk into that church and it does just inspire you, just by the beauty. And Sobienowski also designed some of the designs because it's so richly, ornately painted, the walls, covered in vines and flowers, unbelievable. And Sobienowski had a hand in the design as well of that. The star-spangled ceiling. How could she talk about that in the poem and not have known? So I think she was just inspired. Let's just pretend, let's just humour me and say that she actually made that trip to Krakow, which was not that far from Bavaria. It was nearer than London. It wasn't that far. And as you know, in 1910-11, train travel was easy in Europe. Everyone travelled by train everywhere. And Mansfield would have loved, she loved to travel. She was the archetypal nomad, had been all her life and would be all her life. The idea of getting on a train and going to Krakow does not seem an exceptional thing to do.
That stained glass window is quite Blakey as well. I don't know how she felt about William Blake, but she loved John Keats, didn't she?
So did Murray, didn't they? Both loved it. So there I think, there she is, in the St. Francis Church, the Franciscan church, looking at this massive, I cannot emphasise how tall this stained glass window is, the stars above her, and maybe just emoting, because the title of the stained glass window is To God the Father, and here she is doing what she always does best, that creative reworking, seeing something, and then doing a creative reworking, like that creative impression Summerun that I discovered in the Alexander Turnbull Library last year. So she went to see this very avant-garde play pantomime, silent play pantomime, and then wrote this wonderful creative impression of what she saw, or what she thought she saw, which again Murray never published. Who knows why? That's another mystery. And then and I think she did a little bit the same with this stained glass window, just being impressed by it, just being creative as Mansfield did, doing a creative thing. But I don't think there's any religious element in it as such.
I think if she actually went there, that would explain it, wouldn't it?
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. Otherwise, how do you explain it? You can't say to me she didn't go because you don't know, in the same way that I can't prove to you that she did go. So we can agree to differ, but I think there is a case could be made, a logical, dispassionate case could be made for her going. And I like to think that she did. Let's go back and find that wonderful, there you go.
Sorry to interrupt you, Gerri, but it was really, the whole thing was really interesting. I have to go.
Oh, go.
Who else? But the whole project was really interesting in Pakistan. I didn't know the relation between Mansfield and Sobienowski. This is something new to me.
Well, I do go into it in a lot more detail in this new article. So, and the letters are so poignant. Whatever you think, we think of Sobienowski, because he always comes out really bad, doesn't he, in the biographies?
Yes.
The guy that blackmailed Mansfield.
But then I always imagined him to be incredibly handsome, and then you see him and he isn't, so it's another disappointment.
No, I know. And yet, there he is, you know, these love letters are so beautiful and so poignant. And she really did the dirty on him, you know, just abandoned him in Paris and went to London and, you know, shacked up with Bowden again.
Did she, of course,
Again. And he took her in again.
she saw Bowden before Sobienowski the first time, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I see.
Editing the poetry, have you kind of, has that been the revelation in terms of
Yeah, well, I
Mansfield?
found a dozen new poems last year as well. I'm not making any claims for Mansfield as a poet. I think, you know, I would make a claim for her as, you know, one of the great modernist short story writers. I would not make any claims for her as a poet. But I do think that now, with all the poems that I've been able to find, there may be more, you know, who knows, but the ones I've been able to find now in one place, now is the time for scholars, come this October, to now think again about Mansfield the poet. You know, there might be a PhD there somewhere.
I was just going to chip in that most, I think, accomplished short story writers started off as poets. And I've been looking at Elizabeth Bow recently, and she started off as a poet. And you know, there's so much affinity between the poem and the short story.
I agree, and Mansfield was quite a prolific poet. You know, we've got all her juvenile poems, which are, some of them are really, you know, witty, some of them are awful, you know, but some of them are great. And you can see actually created this little booklet called Little Fronds, and in it there are, I think, 17 poems written in 1904 or 5 when she was at Queen's College in High Street, so, you know, a young teenager, and churning out all this poetry. She loved, you know, to write poetry, and she was still doing it when Murray was editor of the Athenaeum, she was still writing poetry. And when she hated Murray and wanted to get back at him, how does she get back at him? Through poetry. So, you know, you can't just say that. I think it's wrong to sort of deny that side of her creative endeavours. Although I make no claim for them as being.
Sorry to be interrupted, but thank you very much for
No, thanks for coming.
Thanks for aiming Chris again.
I really appreciate you coming. See you next Wednesday, Thursday.
Yes, definitely. All the best. See you there. Take care.
Yeah, there's a wonderful Mansfield conference in Paris.
Yeah.
There's actually overwhelmed by people going, to the extent that there are some delegates that can't go to the embassy and to the there's a wonderful embassy and concert because we're over the 60 people. So yeah, really good.
If there are no more questions, then thank you very much, Gerri. It's been a fascinating
Can I just thank you for coming on such a lovely warm day? And there's so much else going on and taking time out, you know. I would have been happy to just give the paper to my good friends Chris and Amy, so it was lovely to have the rest of you come as well. I'm really grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.